Susan. Welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me this morning. I'm
Thanks so
looking
much for
forward to it.
having me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation and also learning a little bit about the work you're doing. There's a lot of value, and I think right now in society, something you and I have chatted about as well with respect to the whole notion of suicide and the rates going up. And it is a concern. And obviously, as we see the statistics, we see, unfortunately, often it's more men. So that also brings a lot of interest for me being a man, but then also working with men and being in that space. So, and I think a lot of it has also come to the forefront after the pandemic. So I am curious to hear your thoughts around that as well. But before we jump into all of that, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and what's brought you here today.
Been a therapist for over 20 years, working with teens and young adults, and I absolutely love my job. I feel so privileged that people share their world with me and feel that they can trust me and to open up. And so I really love my job. I
Yeah.
love working with teens. I think they're interesting and creative, and I think they get a bad rap still to this day and enjoy working with them.
Hmm.
I also have 3 kids of my own, 26, 21, and 11. And so I have this vantage point of seeing what's gone on for young people over
Hmm.
2 decades. So not only
Hmm.
in my office, but in my own home. And it's really hard to be a young person right now.
Yeah.
And so that is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, The Parenting Connection. It was just released in October. I wanted to look at I looked at what I'm doing in session with
Hmm.
teens and families to create stronger connections and safety at home, and looking at those tools that work and putting them in a book so I could reach more people. Because
Hmm.
there's so many barriers to access help,
Yeah.
whether that's stigma, people won't go,
Hmm.
or they can't afford it, or the services aren't in their area. And that's this book can help families create stronger connections.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I am curious as you were sharing the ages of your children, there is a bit of a gap there between your second and third child. So how was that? Like, did you find that a bit challenging? Because obviously with as we're seeing with children, like I'm a father too, but it's a lot different in this time and age. Obviously, parenting continuously evolves and the challenges change. But did you notice a significant shift between your first two children and then the third one as far as parenting was concerned? Have you encountered new things? Could be challenging or could be opportunities, but I want to get your thoughts on that.
Over the years, it just screens are just so much more prominent. I
Yeah.
did not have the issue with my 2 older kids
Really.
that I have now with my younger one. Not like she's an issue at all, but that the influence of screens and that asking for
Hmm.
screens.
Hmm.
We would, Saturday morning, yeah, we'd watch cartoons, we'd hang
Yeah.
out. We didn't even have a TV in the main room. It was in the basement. The
Yeah.
main room was for us to hang out, play games, cook, all of those things. And so it's not just TV, but now it's the iPad and the gaming and then the cell phone. She's
Yeah.
11 and the conversation comes up weekly,
Hmm. Hmm.
a couple of times a week of why can't she have a cell phone?
Right.
And she has a watch, and most of her friends have a cell phone at 11, and they
Yeah.
did at when she was 9.
Mm.
And so it makes it a lot more difficult in that respect, I would say, the
Yes,
screens.
absolutely. Yeah. And I covered various topics. So just to kind of put in a plug, but we've talked about on this podcast around depression, especially in this age, especially with teen girls, has become more prominent. And one of the leading causes, based on the expert I had on, was social media and this connection we have constantly to our peers. Whereas growing up, what I had observed and experienced was you kind of have those contact points at school, but then you go home and you spend time with your family and on weekends as well. But now it's like 24/7 almost. And then the other piece we've talked about on this podcast is also screen time management. And you've alluded to the work of Jonathan Haidt as well. And that, again, is the challenge that all of us are trying to face. And as you've touched on, some parents have different views. So kids may have cell phones or maybe not. So it is something we have to navigate. So I appreciate you sharing your own experience. Now, again, talking about your experience, are you able to shed some light on the Lift project and what that's all about? And how did you make that shift into that space and what motivated you to start this initiative?
Me do a documentary on suicide. And I had actually asked her years prior, would you ever consider doing a documentary on suicide as I'm watching suicide rates increase?
Mm-hmm.
And she actually didn't respond. And so when she reached out to me, I sent her back my email and said, of course I'll help you. I
Mm.
asked you, we need this,
Yeah.
please. Yes, this is amazing. Thank you. And so we worked on that. And the film is called My Sister Live. And it's a beautiful story. And we do private screenings through the Live Project and a panel discussion afterwards. And to watch what happens between people in the audience is amazing. They start turning to each other and asking, have you ever had thoughts of self harm or suicide? My favorite is when parents attend with their teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
The film is approved for 14 and up. And it just opens a conversation
Mm-hmm.
in just such an organic way.
Yeah.
And after we started doing screenings with the film, we decided to create, the mom and the sister decided to create a project, and that's a Live project. And I'm the strategic and technical advisor on the film, but I'm also the mental health director of the project.
Mm-hmm.
And so that project is helping get the film out into communities and schools. And we also have a game and we do workshops. It's an amazing organization, and I really value my time there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for building on that. Now, maybe if we can get into suicidal ideation and what's happening, if that's okay, I do want to understand. I know when you and I chatted previously, one of the things you mentioned focus area is often the upstream approach, right? So unfortunately, we're in a time where a lot of the things we do is fairly reactive, but having that proactive approach can be very helpful. So when it comes to suicidal ideation or when people are having a plan, what are some things we can do proactively? And I think that would also be a nice segue into the connection piece that you touched on with the Live project. But let's maybe talk about what is happening on that upstream side and what is some of the work you're doing.
In the book, The Parenting Connection, it's not, I want to make sure people know it's not just about suicide,
Mm-hmm.
but it is an upstream approach
Mm-hmm.
to create a connection with your teen. And that really safeguards them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when someone is suicidal, they can feel trapped and like they have no way out. And when I sit with clients and I ask them those questions, are you having thoughts of self harm? Are you having thoughts of suicide? Generally, I see an immediate relief. I actually see their bodies relax. Okay, you just said those words for me. And now I know it's okay to talk about it. You just gave me permission to talk to you about it, and you're willing to hear me. And that is in this office. It's a safe place. There's no history of defensiveness, negative cycles of interaction, problem jumping to problem solving, all those things that are judgment, criticalness, all those things that are barriers to create closeness.
Mm-hmm.
And they are the focus, right, in the session with me. But parents can create an environment at home where kids come to them,
Mm-hmm.
not And it's a daily kind of release for them of how did your day go? And they really can share like what's happening for them, that emotional closeness of the safety of saying, I had a crappy day and this is why, or I don't feel like I belong today,
Hmm.
um, or I had a fight with a friend or whatever it is. And because you have that in place, it actually safeguards against this catastrophic event. In the book, I talk about let the water drip and the pipe won't freeze.
Hmm.
If we let our kids share how they're doing daily, it will reduce the risk of a catastrophic event, I guess
Hmm.
is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So you're emphasizing that connection piece. Now, how do you navigate that? Like, because from a child's perspective, sometimes they can think that my parents really not going to understand what I'm going through, or there is a bit of shame associated with even sharing some of the difficulties. So, just to navigate that, what are some things parents can do to facilitate that connection from that perspective? And obviously, it's important to not be judgmental and try to see and understand and hear your child, but how do you even get to that point where there
Mhm.
could be a lot of hesitation or resistance around it? And sometimes when children are being bullied, they are also fearful of bringing that to the forefront because they don't want the parent to overreact. So, what are some things parents can do to facilitate these
So
connections?
in the book, I talk about the mom dad role versus the parent role. And I came up with this when many years ago, talking to teens of what percent of interaction do you perceive as positive with your parent?
Hmm.
And most say around 30%. And then when I ask them what makes up that 30%, they talk about we went skiing together, we went for a walk, we cooked together, we listened to music, we played games, like all of those things that bring joy and create a connection. It's
Hmm.
quality and quantity of time spent with your kids.
Hmm.
And so when I ask them what makes up the other 70% that you perceive as negative, they talk about things like they told me to do my homework. I had to do my chores. I all of those to-dos that parents have to do, right? To keep kids on track.
Hmm.
And so when we're looking at connection, we need to be staying in the mom dad role because that's what cultivates connection
Hmm.
the majority of the time. You have to have the parent stuff.
Yeah.
And so it is a process because if you're in that mom dad role, that warm, loving side, experiencing joy, you're creating safety, you're creating connection, and your kid will come to you with those things that are bothering them because it feels safer. It's
Yes.
really about asking yourself, how do my kids feel around me?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I'm wondering also a lot of the times when I'm working with clients, I see a lot of enmeshment in their relationships where the parents feel like their child may be a victim, so they someone that needs to be rescued. And I'm wondering where do you draw that line where you also want to help your child build resilience and have a differentiated sense of self so they can, as they grow older and go out into the real world, they have these skills that they can navigate on their own. So where do it needs to be a fine balance from my view, but how do you draw that line? And I'm curious to again see what the literature says around that.
It is a balance. When I talk about being in the mom dad role, that is talking about the interactions between parent and
Mhm.
child, parent and teen. We need to make sure that our kids are not on screen all day,
Mhm.
that they are out there doing things, feeling good about themselves, setting goals and achieving them, whether that's I want to have more time playing on the baseball field and less time on the bench. And how do I get there to do that? And
Yes.
supporting your kid doing that,
Mhm.
not you telling the coach that,
Right.
hey, they're not playing enough. It's about talking to your kid about what do you think? Ask them questions and let them come up with the answer. What do you think you need to do
Mhm.
to have more baseball time? If that's playing time, if that's what you want,
Right.
we need to One of the things that we're seeing when our kids are on screens all the time is that they're not out there achieving. And
Right.
achieving is what really helps us build self-esteem, self-worth, and that is resilience right
Mhm.
there.
Mhm.
I always say to my kids, make sure there's got to be a balance with social media, the older ones, of course. The
Yeah.
younger one does not have any. She's not happy about it, but
Yeah.
make sure that you are living in your own life and not
Mhm.
just watching other people live theirs.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing you're touching on is with social media, for example, is that comparison trap, right? So you're constantly comparing, and to your point, that it does have that impact on self-esteem because you're not really going out and achieving things. Now you've touched on your own experience with your younger child. So and even when she's looking at her peers who may have cell phones, how have you been able to then navigate some of those conversations and continue to have that connection with her, knowing that you're having to say no to a lot of things, which often can, it's tough, right? Like the tough love whole idea there is, how do you get your child to understand that, this is short term, the short-term gratification versus like the long-term piece, right? So how do you help children, especially considering their brains haven't fully developed at that age and they don't necessarily have that long-term vision or bigger picture view in various things. So yeah, I'm just curious to understand how you've navigated it.
It's hard.
Yeah.
I'll just say that. It's
Yeah,
hard. And as I
absolutely.
said, she comes around and I don't know, a couple of times a week. And her older sister was here and she was like, say, hey, okay, Olivia, tell me any upsides of
Mm,
social media. And why do you really, or about having a smartphone, really?
yeah,
It's not about even social media at this
right.
point. It's just that she wants a smartphone and she's can't come up with anything. What's the difference between your watch and having a phone? And is it because it's peer pressure? Is it
Mm,
because everyone has it and you don't?
mm,
What is it? And she really couldn't come up with a whole lot, just that I want it.
mm,
And I was just, I love you too much. I see it every day what the phones are doing with two young people. And
mm,
I just can't let that happen to you.
mhm,
It's not time.
mhm,
Your older sister and brother, phones were different then, but they didn't even get a phone until the summer before eighth grade. And at that time, it was a flip phone.
mm,
Who's that? And she goes, I don't know, Mom. Get it? Do you get this? I don't know these people. I was like, wow, that's weird.
yeah.
Like it was new then and it wasn't overused.
Mhm.
And now it's just so like in your face.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that peer pressure piece, again, it comes back to that finding that right connection with parents, right? So, as parents who are navigating this, and as you touched on, it's constantly evolving. What are some things you can offer to parents? And obviously, it's not coming from a place of judgment because everyone's trying to figure this out. And the challenges, as we've touched on, are constantly changing and evolving as well. So not only do you have to stay on top of it yourself, but then you're also having to guide children, could be multiple, who are experiencing different levels of peer pressure and other challenges in their own lives. So, as parents, what can you do? So, I know we've talked about the connection piece, but what are some other things parents can do to help facilitate that relationship where the child feels safe to even come and have these conversations?
I think again, just an open environment. Parents
Mhm.
need to be modeling, talking about how they're feeling too,
Yes.
and not where their kids feel like they have to care for their parent, but just that it normalizes the conversation. I talk about in the book the difference between emotional transparency and vulnerability.
Mm,
And we hear as professionals and pop culture, everyone's, oh, you have to be vulnerable, you have to be vulnerable. And in new relationships, sure, you're going to feel constant vulnerability, maybe,
mhm,
but vulnerability implies risk
mhm,
and to share. And we don't want our kids to feel like it's risky to
mhm,
share at home. So, really, the goal is emotional transparency, not for our kids to feel vulnerable with us at home.
Yeah.
And again, that is building on those moments where your child has some hesitation when they're trying to share something with you, and you reassuring them that it is okay to talk about this one too.
Mhm.
And so parents have to be comfortable talking about difficult topics, sharing their own feelings and emotions, and modeling that for their kids.
Mhm. And do you feel there is still an aspect of vulnerability around the humanness around it, right? Like I think we're all human and we're all figuring it out. And sometimes I feel like as parents, we can give the impression, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, where we may give the impression that we have it all figured out, and that puts a lot of pressure on the child. But if you're able to show up vulnerably and say, "Hey, I'm also figuring this out. This is very unique to me," and then what I've come to realize in a lot of relationships is if you tackle the problem together, where you give the impression or you make sure the other person understands that we are both part of the solution, whether it's you and your partner or you and your child, that makes it easier for them to also be engaged and feel like their their opinions and their beliefs and what they have to say is taken into consideration. How much of that factors in as well as part of the vulnerability?
I think that's huge. In fact, even when you're doing like rules and chores and privileges that kids need to come up with what they want, it's a partnership. I
Mm-hmm.
talk about in the book that it's a collaboration with veto power. So we are doing this together, we're in it together, we're collaborating on the parent is relying on the teenager for information. What do you need? What do you want? How are you doing? We need that information as a
Mm-hmm.
parent to help our kids navigate what's going on in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for teenagers to talk about it, that let teenagers have the reins and you follow close behind. Let them lead you
Yes.
as opposed to you leading them.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are times where you will need to lead them. I'm not saying there won't be, but it works out so wonderfully when you let them lead and they're like looking behind, like you're right here with me. You know what? I'm not doing this well. I need more help. I need more support. And it's this kind of give and take, this collaboration, and that's what works.
Yes, absolutely. So I appreciate the collaboration piece. There's a couple of other things that come to mind as you're sharing too is consistency, right? So if we're not consistently doing what we're saying we will do, that can impact the relationship as well because I feel that it's hard for the children to trust us, right? So then there's trust is being lost, and that can take a lot of time to build back up, right? It already takes enough time to build to begin with, but then once you lose it, it's harder. So, how important is consistency in this piece?
Consistency is huge all throughout a child's life, right? Whether that's consistency that you're there to support them or just consistency in rules and boundaries and all of those things.
Yeah.
It's really important because structure can feel comforting, can feel grounding, feel safe.
Mhm.
And of course, that structure there has to be a little flexibility in that structure.
Yeah.
And it needs to be reasonable, right? Not
Yeah.
like really harsh rules kind of
Yeah.
thing. But
Yeah.
consistency is really important. And just, I don't know why my mind also goes to this, but modeling in that as well. If we are telling our kid no screen time, or if we're telling them we have to be willing to do that ourselves to
Mhm.
model that for them because it makes it more difficult when we're doing what we're telling them not to do.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And I know we've touched on it in various ways, but how again, coming back to the vulnerability piece, how important is our apologies in that space, right? So it's okay to make mistakes and then it's okay to apologize. And then definitely the apology means something if there's action and change behind it. Otherwise, it kind of falls short after a while. but role modeling that for our children too, that, you know, we're going to go out into the world, we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to have to apologize, but then put in some corrective action in place to make sure we're learning from our mistakes. That obviously requires vulnerability and courage to be able to accept where we may have fallen short as parents or caretakers, and then being able to talk about it openly with our children.
Apologies, genuine, sincere apologies are very important in any relationship. And I think that parents are afraid to apologize sometimes because they think they'll lose their power
Mm-hmm.
or their place, right, of being that parent if they apologize. But actually, the opposite happens. When teens tell me when my parent doesn't apologize, it's confusing, it's upsetting, and I don't understand. Why won't they just say that they're sorry?
Right.
They actually lose respect for their parent as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to gaining respect of, yeah, I'm owning that.
Mm-hmm.
That was on me and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The answer could be no, right?
Mm-hmm.
But because I yelled, I'm sorry for that part. I really am. I'm sorry that I yelled.
Yeah.
And the answer still can be no, you can't go to the party,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it goes back to what you touched on about collaboration and the partnership, right? If there's no apology or taking ownership, then it can also feel like a hierarchical relationship and not necessarily a partnership. So it's important to, again, if we're talking about making the child feel like they're being seen and understood and even heard, the apology is crucial in that sense, because now the child feels like, okay, if my parent isn't making a mistake, then they're not saying that, okay, I'm perfect, that they're also flawed, and they're taking ownership of that piece. And
And then the kid's more likely to apologize
Mhm.
for their part.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many times where, even at home, we may get into an argument and my kids raise their voice or
Mhm.
whatever. And they go to their room, they come out 5 minutes later and they go, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I don't know why I did that. And so many times teenagers don't know why, right? They're impulsive. They get out of control
Yes.
quickly. They can. But for them to go away, reflect, and then come back and say, I'm sorry, I don't know why I did that.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Sounds great.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that goes back to the role modeling piece, right? And
Right.
that corrective action piece that I touched on is also important, because if you continue to apologize for the same thing over and over again, irrespective of what the relationship is, whether it's with your children, your partner, and your family, it loses value after a while if you're not making the change, right? Because then you're basically, the message you're giving is it's not important to you how your behavior or your words are making the other person feel.
Yeah.
I do want to come back to something else that you shared with me, is the whole idea around this challenge we experience where we're unable to talk to each other about what we're feeling, right? And I want to bring the conversation again full circle with the suicidal ideation piece. But what is this challenge we see with people unable to talk about their feelings, and how is that then leading to some of the other
Yeah.
consequences we've touched on?
Mhm. Well, we only know what we know, which is our experience.
Mhm.
And so if we didn't grow up talking about how we feel, we're probably not going to be comfortable talking about how we feel unless we really work at it.
Mhm.
And I know I didn't grow up talking about my feelings. And that is I'm not trying to say anything negative about my parents. That's
Mhm.
just the way it was, right?
Yeah.
Nobody did.
Mhm.
And so maybe I wouldn't be as comfortable talking about my feelings if I hadn't gone through the training of being a therapist, right? It is something that is so important when we look at what happens when people bury stuff, their feelings over time, depression, suicidal ideation, alcoholism, substance abuse, all of those things. Sitting in recovery, they're talking about this happened to me and I didn't talk about it, or, and it doesn't even have to be some traumatic experience. It could just be I was struggling with this or I felt this way about myself. And so, as a society, we really need to start talking about how we feel. And I think we're making progress,
Mhm.
just even talking about mental health. But taking care of our mental health also includes talking about how we feel.
Yes. Yeah, and that is definitely a challenge for everyone, as you've touched on, because it's not something we learn, and I don't think it's something people still learn. It takes practice and willingness to do it for sure. Now, with the suicidal ideation, as therapists, we're kind of given some ideas around when it becomes a concern, especially if there's a plan. But when you're working with someone and they are to share that, okay, I'm having some ideas or thoughts based on your experience and what you've been talking about, when does it become serious? And what do you do even when someone's saying, I'm just having some thoughts, but there's really no plan at this point? When
Mhm.
is it a red flag? How do you guide people who are struggling with the thoughts?
Mhm. It is a process. And in the first session with anyone, I will ask them, have you ever experienced thoughts of self-harm or
Mhm.
suicide? I will ask them if they say yes, I'll say, when was that last time that you experienced those thoughts? And we talk about it. And they sense again that I'm comfortable that they can talk to me about it.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that people understand that just because somebody's having thoughts of self harm or suicide doesn't mean they're going to end their life. But it is definitely something that you need to continue to have the conversation with them about,
Mhm.
just like I do in session.
Yeah.
And so, continually just asking questions, letting them talk and express themselves. But really, there's some key pieces here is timing, like when was the last time you had thoughts of self-harm or suicide? Can you tell me more about that? What was that about? Did they do they have a plan to actually take their life? And do they have means with them at their home, in their room, that is a part of that plan? Do they have the means to move forward with that?
Mhm.
It's almost like a feeling that you can also get of, the severity of how the person feels, the distress that they are currently experiencing by just looking at them when they're talking about it. And that distress is really part of that kind of understanding where they are in the risk factors.
Mhm.
The other piece of all of this, which is so important, is their support system and who is in their lives. Is this something that you can, because I work with teenagers, is this something that you can tell your parents about? And they know that I have to tell their parent. If you're having thoughts of self harm or suicide, I do have to tell your parent.
Mhm.
Do you want me to do that with you? Do you want to leave the room? What do you want to do? What makes you feel most comfortable? That is a big indicator of what it might be like at home
Mhm.
if they can't tell their parent, if they're scared, if they're frightened. And then another assessment within the assessment is how the parent receives this information. Is the parent, I've had parents get mad
Mhm.
before.
Yeah.
That is another risk factor,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so seeing what the parent's reaction is when you share with them the news
Mhm.
is really a big indicator. And so this isn't something that, I think the other piece of all this is everyone's rushed. We don't have time. Next client, next patient. You have to cancel your next patient. Like you have to take the time to sit with this person and let them speak and do the assessment. And even you sitting and holding their experience with them is healing in and itself.
Yes.
It's so important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things you alluded to is also the trust that needs to be built in the therapeutic relationship, right? And that can take time, but it's one of the most crucial factors in that space. But if we were to extend that to, say, outside the therapeutic setting, if you know someone on a personal level, whether it's a friend or a family member who may be having suicidal ideation or thoughts, what are some people what are some things people can do to foster that support as well outside of the therapeutic setting?
Mhm.
And when do you know that there's a concern, right? Because you hear so many people saying, I thought everything was fine, and then it's too late. And then people then internalize that guilt as well because they feel like they could have done more. So what is that more they can do? And again, how much of it is for you to take on? How much of it is, unfortunately, you could be doing the best you can, but sometimes those things fall out of your control as well.
That in mind, that we can only do what we can do. We can let people know that we are there for them, that we are there to listen and support them. But ultimately, it is up to that person's choice to receive that support and not take their life.
Mhm.
I think everyone needs to have a mental health ally, which is at least one person, right? One person that they could share whatever with, and even have a cup of coffee once a week, or a phone call, or a Zoom, or a FaceTime, or whatever it is. And we all need to have that space. And in that is the agreement. You have to share with me if you are really struggling, if you're having thoughts of self harm or suicide, and you have to get help. And here are the resources that either one of us can use. Either one of us can use these resources,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
finding those in the community.
Yes, absolutely. Now, as someone who may be having suicidal thoughts from time to time, there could be a fear that if I were to tell someone, whether it's a friend or family member, I don't want to scare them either, right? So, again, if you're someone who's struggling with it, how do you initiate that conversation and ask for support without it becoming like a big deal where the other person's constantly checking in on you or is worried or maybe even decides to call someone to keep an eye on you? Like, those are some fears that can come up as you shared that those thoughts can occur from time to time, especially if you're going through a stressful situation in life or whatever the case may be. So, as someone who's struggling with that, how do you then seek support, or what are some boundaries you can set when you're asking for support?
So if you're talking about like within a social circle or a
Yeah.
family, or
Yeah.
what have you, yeah. I think again, it is about finding that person who is more willing to hear, that is more open. But I think a big piece of this is, and it's a shame that it is up to that person who's having the thoughts of suicide, but they do need to educate a little bit. Like, I'm having these thoughts. This it can be common, but that doesn't mean I'm going to take my life.
Mhm.
But I do need to have somebody to support me. And are you willing to do that with me?
Mhm. Yeah. How much of it is based on trust? Where, say, if I'm talking to someone and I said, okay, is this something I need to be worried about? That you're telling me you're having these thoughts. Do I need to be worried, or you're just telling me these thoughts so you have someone you can have a supportive relationship with? Where do you again feel that level of comfort that okay, maybe it's just thoughts and it's not something I need to be worried about because the other person is telling me that?
Well, again, I think it's, we are relying on the person who's having the thoughts of self harm and or suicide to be honest. And,
Mhm.
and we can only be open and say, you can share with me. I do need to know if you feel like you're in imminent danger.
Mhm.
I do need you to tell me if you have a plan, or if you have the means to follow through with the plan in your
Mhm.
possession.
Mhm.
Will you be honest with me?
Mhm.
And making that agreement with that person.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, I know, Susan, we've covered quite a bit. I do want to give you the opportunity again and kind of throw it back to you to see if there's anything we haven't touched on that is of importance. I've tried to least identify a lot of the questions I would have on my end and bring those to the forefront. But I also want to give you an opportunity to share other areas that we may not have touched on at this point.
We've talked a lot about the different components of what I call the volley, which is very important. And when we talk about how can we create connection with our kids, I termed it in the book as the volley.
Mm.
And just to explain from the very beginning of when we have a child, to create a secure attachment, there's a volley there. A child serves up a need and the parent responds. And that creates a secure attachment over time, that repetition of that. And in the book, I talk about that volley is still needed. And it just looks different as our kids get older. And instead of that volley being labor intensive, feeding, changing diapers, cuddling, rocking, it's changed into more of an emotional connection. And that connection is cultivated through listening to understand your child, validating their experience, empathizing, reassuring them, and then that owning and repairing when feelings get hurt or we're not in our best parenting moments kind of
Yeah.
thing. And that helps that create that secure attachment where kids are coming to us when they need something, when they have something that they're struggling with. That's what the goal is, that we want our kids to feel like they can come to us and we are that person that offers comfort, reassurance, and support. And through that volley over time, that cultivates that experience for them, that
Yes.
feeling for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing there is really that idea of attunement, right? So when the child is coming to us, but then looking at that opportunity and being fully present and not being distracted, because that could easily break that bond or that opportunity. So that attunement is really important. And one of the ways I've come to understand it is, I think John Gottman talked about it. Obviously, his focus was really on the relationship side with your partner, but facing your child as well, right? When they come to you and giving them that full attention so they know that they're being understood and heard and seen, everything we've talked about thus far.
Yeah, giving them attention. We got to get rid of the screens. We got to work on greetings and good nights, looking, not, hey, do you have homework? It's, hi, so I'm so happy to see you. I missed you today. Or these moments build connection. Time at the dinner table. We are losing time at the dinner table
Mm-hmm.
between kids' extracurricular activities and the academic pressures and demands. We're losing time at the dinner table. And it's so important. There is proof that time at the dinner table reduces violence, substance abuse, like all of these things. It really rings true that we need to be having meals together.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, Susan, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation and everything you've shared. I can imagine the listeners will get a ton of value out of this, whether they're trying to build relationships with their children or other people in their lives. And obviously, as we touched on at the beginning, whole suicidal thing has really become a problem and come to the forefront in the sense that we are trying to figure out how to support each other. And it's really important. So thank you again for sharing some of your insights. Now, for listeners who would like to learn more about your work or even find you online, what are some ways they can do that?
My website's susancasso.com, CASO, Instagram, susan.casso. The book, The Parenting Connection, How to Build Lifelong Family Relationship, is available wherever books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And then the Live Project, if you want to go to the Live Project, it's theliveproject.org, and Live is spelled LIV.
Great. We will definitely put all of that in the show notes. But thank you so much again for coming on here and sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a joy to have a conversation with you. Thank you.